A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to this special webinar brought to you by Absa Agribusiness. My name is Zugedwa Solomon and I work for Absa Global Investment Solutions. It gives me great pleasure to be facilitating this discussion with my experts here in studio, where over the next short while we'll be weighing in on that conflict happening in Ukraine, of course that invasion by the Russian government, and of course its impact on the agricultural sector. For this insightful discussion, I'm joined in studio by Marilyn Lowe, who is a senior economist here at Absa Agribusiness, as well as Roland Hanwood, who is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. Marilyn, thank you so much for your time and welcome.
Thanks, Zuki. It's great being here.
I'm sure you echo that sentiment too, Roland. Thank you so much for having taken time to join us for this so important discussion on that conflict happening in Ukraine and, of course, its impact on agricultural sector.
Thanks, Zuki, and Marlene, nice to be here with you.
Now, before we jump straight into it, just a quick context or a recap, if you may, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A day from today will mark exactly a month since Russia launched a full-scale military attack on Ukraine, this on the 24th of February this year. Since then, many lives have been lost, millions of people have been displaced, and the toll on both the Russian as well as the Ukrainian economies continue to mount. As the efforts to reach a negotiated settlement are ongoing, we zone in on how what many pundits see as Europe's first, or rather worst, conflict since World War II is impacting the agricultural sector. In Southern Africa, agriculture is central to fostering economic growth, reducing poverty, and improving food security. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for some 30% of the world's wheat exports. And as a result of the war, South Africa is increasingly becoming confronted with elevated inflationary pressures, even as the two countries in question may not be major agricultural trade partners to South Africa. How then is the ongoing war potentially impacting the domestic agricultural sector? And before Marilyn and Roland engages, please make sure that you too, our audience, send us your questions as you are part of this. As the conversation continues, please use the functionality on your screens to send us those questions, and we will most certainly get through those throughout our discussion. Marilyn, welcome, as already indicated, and to you too, Roland. In fact, let me start with you, Roland. Now, as we see the news headline, as we see the conversations go on around this conflict in Russia, can you give us or some highlights of this geopolitical tension in Ukraine? Why Ukraine and why now?
Thank you. Yes, I think there are three categories of reasons. And I say categories because it's a complex reality. This is not something that happened just because of, as many people say, the potential for NATO expansion. And the three categories of reasons center around domestic politics in Russia. There are clear indications that Mr. Putin is under more and more pressure because of the economy in Russia not performing. People's quality of life is under pressure. And then he's cementing his position in power. He's becoming much more authoritarian. And he's definitely out at destroying any semblance of opposition, as we've seen in the last days. So there's a strong domestic drive. Part of his survival is probably dependent on what he's doing. Secondly, if one looks at Ukraine, there's a history of Ukraine being part of the Soviet Union, and there is this idea under the elite in Russia that they must reconstruct the Russian Empire of the past, and Ukraine is key to that. But Ukraine is also economically important. There's technological skills, there's industrial skills that would be nice to have under control. And then there is also the idea that seems to be a driving idea in Russia that Ukraine is a state that is failing. It's teetering on the brink, and it is occupied by power-hungry elites, and they have no legitimacy. Of course, that is a serious miscalculation on the side of Mr. Putin and his advisors. We see the Ukrainians steadfast in their resistance. So obviously this is not a state teetering on the brink. It's not one that wants to go back to a non-democratic reality, to put it softly, and one that wants to be under the ambit of Russia and Moscow. Definitely not. So that's the Ukrainian context. And then regionally, the idea that Ukraine is actually leaning towards the east, towards Russia, is also a serious miscalculation. The conflict in that sense goes back to 2014. We had serious rioting in Ukraine because people wanted a more pro-European outlook in their government. That led to a change in governance. That led to the establishment of more democratic processes and institutions, and a leaning towards at least the European Union, changing the constitution that said Ukraine must become a member of NATO. But that's not Ukraine's decision. NATO was never really opening up to this idea. It was something that they said would happen in future. But that unsettled the leadership in Russia, and they started this campaign in 2014 when they annexed parts of the southeastern Ukraine. The Crimea, especially important, the Donbas region. So the conflict that we see now has been long in the making, and there are many reasons that drove the situation to what it is today.
Most certainly, and I'm very pleased in how you broke that down into three main particular events. Now, Marianne, having listened to Roland and how he's broken it down to the Russian economy, Ukraine itself, and obviously regional type of context. From your point of view, how are these events playing out in as far as the agricultural commodities market is concerned?
Thanks, Suki. So I think Ukraine is often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, and rightly so, because it plays a key role not only in Europe but on the global stage for three commodities, or more than three commodities, but I want to highlight three. The first is maize or corn, and wheat, and then sunflower oil. And in each of these, Russia and the Ukraine exports a notable share of total global exports. So when the invasion started, we saw prices of these commodities really rallying. Since then, there has been a stabilization for corn, and we've seen a slight correction in the wheat market. I think underpinning these price movements is the fact that global stocks are at very, very low levels. So reactions to prices are typically very severe when we have low global stocks. And then also it was in anticipation to supply disruptions that could occur in the UK, so in the Ukraine. So although supply disruptions has been limited to this stage, if you think of the winter wheat, which is typically produced in the southern half of the country, that needs to be harvested towards the middle of the year. And although the crop condition seems or is reportedly good, it's not clear how access to inputs and problems or damage to infrastructure will affect the ability to harvest and store and export the wheat. Yeah. And in terms of corn, the planting season is due to commence in April through to May. And again, inputs is an issue. I know President Zelensky did appeal to producers to keep on producing to ensure food security in the Ukraine. But it's left to be seen to what extent that would be possible given what's currently happening there.
So certainly quite an elevated sort of sense of uncertainty at play. And it pains me to ask you this question, since we just considered to the amount of uncertainty that is at play in as far as this sort of scenario is playing out. In fact, on that, if we just look at the crystal ball and try and ascertain what could lie ahead, what sort of plausible scenarios could you share with us around this particular context, particularly around chances of an agreement between the two parties?
Okay, that's difficult to call at this stage. And the reason is that the military campaign has not progressed as it was expected to progress. Expectation was that the Russian forces would move in and very quickly overrun Ukraine. I mean, on paper, there is no comparison between these two countries. But it is very clear that the Russian military campaign, the planning and execution of the campaign is seriously deficient. And then, on top of that, there are serious questions being asked now about the capacity, capability, and the quality of the Russian military and its equipment. that changes everything. The expectation from the outside was not that Ukraine would hold up for a month and actually keep the Russian forces back in the way that they did. And that must change and this is key, it must change the calculations in Moscow. Because what was expected from the outside was that Moscow will call the shots. Yes, there will be opposition, there will be criticism, there will be engagement, but in the end, and we've seen this play out so many times in the past, that Moscow will more or less get its way. And that's not happening. And indications are that Mr. Putin is recalculating. He's no longer talking of some of the changes that he indicated as a requirement at the beginning of this campaign. So yes, negotiations will continue. In the end, there must be an agreement. What the agreement can be is macro level, a neutral Ukraine, but with guaranteed security of its existence and sovereignty. Probably lots of influence and support from Europe, not necessarily from Moscow that much, but at least the guarantee that it will not become a member of NATO. And there would be a demilitarized zone, so to speak. There will also not be that strong military that Ukraine would need to take on a country such as Russia. The other option would be basically dividing the country into call it an eastern and western sector. One under the Russian control and one more under European influence and control. So that's an option. It's not ideal, but it's an option. It's not likely that we will go back to the Ukraine-Russia situation that we had before. But it will be determined in the short term by the next moves. Will Belarus become more directly involved in the conflict? There's a huge risk of the conflict spilling over because of errors being made, miscalculations, or just simply bad luck, something going wrong. That's going to be determined by the kind of military equipment used and the quality of equipment and how dependable it is. So there's a lot of unknowns in terms of where this can go, how long it's going to take. And the one thing that changed all the expectations is the level of resistance and the successful resistance so far of the Ukrainian forces. And I think the leadership of President Zelensky is quite important in this context.
I thank you, Ronald. Just to extend on that question, in the scenario where we see Ukraine potentially, of course, we're only speaking in hypotheticals, where we see Ukraine being split into two, what would that likely mean for trade relations, particularly where now you would have allies aligned to Russia and then the other allies aligned to whatever second part of Ukraine could potentially look like?
I think that would depend on the nature of that split. If it's going to be the southeastern part, and that's where the Russians have dug in at this stage, taking control of the ports and access to the sea, that's going to be important in the sense that Ukraine becomes essentially a landlocked country. But that does not mean the end of its trade, because it will probably have an open access to the European Union through very good land corridors. But it is going to have an impact in that they have lost access to the sea, direct trade, and some of what is important for them in terms of commodities. What it gives Russia is control, the threat, the direct threat of NATO, if that's the threat, moving east, getting access to good harbors, getting access to the sea directly and very close to the Russian Navy, that's removed. It gives them more options, more access routes. But it does not mean the end of Ukraine in terms of its trade and its agriculture, etc. It's going to have an impact on its industry. It's going to have an impact on the way in which it's going to engage with others.
And Amarlien, just on that particular discussion, or rather that particular point that Roland has just put across, what could this imply then for global trade and other key issues such as poverty levels as well as the living standards?
Great, thanks, Suki. So I think the trade issue goes far beyond just the Ukraine and Russia issue. I think reports from The Economist, those of you who read The Economist, have said that this war is actually the third big blow to globalization. So it was first Mr. Trump's trade wars with China, then obviously the pandemic, and now this war. And I think the war has implications reaching far beyond those two countries, as I said. Over the short term, I think what the war is resulting in is a further and huge disruption in global logistics. So from talks that we've had with exporters and market stakeholders, there's definitely reports that shipping now takes even longer because of the fact that containers get screened due to sanctions, and because there's a build-up in certain key ports such as Rotterdam. So this is a huge disruption to supply chains, which is obviously something that manufacturers or suppliers would want to mitigate. And I think that is the short-term drive for countries and manufacturers and industries to be more inward-looking, so to kind of focus on where they can find alternative sources, more sustainable sources that's not affected by the disruptions of the war. But then I think to Roland's point, this is then reinforced by a ideological or a political drive where people are more focused on their national, what would you call it, Roland, a nationalist drive or an inward-looking drive?
Focus on the self.
Focus on the self, which then makes this a more medium-term phenomenon, I would say. And then I think an additional complication is then what you are seeing in commodity markets, where we see these absolute high staple food prices. And if history has taught us anything, it's that from 2008 to 2006, we saw extremely high corn and wheat and oilseed prices. And they're typically countries like Russia, Vietnam, Egypt, to name a few, closed their borders for exports for things like wheat and rice, and that amplified the price movements that we saw during that significant price run. So I think this is a lot of facets. I think all in all, the economists refer to it as globalization, but I think the benefits of what we've seen from globalization in the 90s and early 2000s can potentially be reversed or lose momentum given the dynamics that's at play in terms of trade and logistics and so forth.
And then Marlene, if I'm sitting at home and I'm watching the news cycle as they happen, and particularly if I'm also a player in the agricultural sector, what does this mean for the South African context in basic terms?
So I don't think the agricultural sector is unique in this sense. I think any country engaging in global trade will find it more challenging for various reasons. Firstly, because of these logistical disruptions. Secondly, because of the fact that countries will be becoming more inward-looking, so market access will typically be more cumbersome due to policies that are implemented to kind of safeguard local industries. So I don't think this is a issue that's pertaining to agriculture specifically, but anyone engaging in global trade would probably find it more harder than before the invasion in February.
And Roland, quickly taking the conversation to America, we saw on the 8th of March this year, President Joe Biden issuing an executive order prohibiting the importation of Russian origin oil, liquefied natural gas, as well as coal into the United States. Of course, this resulting in upward pressure in prices of oil. What are the possibilities for European countries also potentially looking at imposing sanctions on Russia, and of course lessons that could be taken from a historical energy context in as far as sanctions are imposed?
I think one must be realistic that the US has imposed very strong sanctions, but they do not depend on Russian energy supplies. Russia is the third biggest producer of oil. The US is the second biggest producer of oil. And that's something people often forget. They think oil only comes from the Middle East. So there's a different context. Europe must be careful. They've imposed very strict and strong sanctions on Russia, but not energy. And this week they could not agree on the final step, and that's on the energy sanctions. Countries such as Germany depend for 35% of their energy needs on Russian gas, and that's significant. So this is probably going to happen over time. If the conflict continues, it's going to come, but it's going to come in a different way. The European Union has already indicated that they are going to change their approach to managing energy and the use of energy, especially from Russia. They're going to curtail it, and they're going to taper it off into 2030, towards the end of the decade. Some will do it quicker than others, and then one must look at alternatives. I know Algeria has already indicated to Italy, who is also a major user of Russian gas, saying that we can supply, there is an existing pipeline, we can replace the gas that you get from Russia. So there are alternatives. The key question is, what is the objective and what happens in the long run? The objective that Mr. Biden gave was to degrade the Russian economy to such a point that it cannot sustain a military to do what it is doing now. That indicates a long-term approach, because you can't do that in 2 weeks or a month or 6 months or even a year. So it's long-term. There's a lot that needs to happen to achieve that. Second issue is, what happens when you have sanctions on a country such as Russia, and those are lifted after quite a long time? You don't just walk back and replace your markets that were closed, or retake the markets that you had. We've seen in many instances in the world, even in South Africa's case, where markets that have been lost due to sanctions are likely not to be returned to you when you start trading again. And if you have the harsh sanctions regime imposed on Russia, and this is a big if it continues for a significant period, it's going to have serious long-term effects. And Russia will not just walk back and retake that markets. Germany and others are going to find alternatives. They're going to probably move to green energy much quicker than they would have. And that has other implications. Remember, South Africa was to benefit significantly from a European fund to assist us with going green.
Yes.
That kind of funding is probably not going to happen in the way that it was expected, because European countries are going to look at this and say, we have to look at ourselves first. So there are secondary effects that are going to impact other role players in markets such as South Africa.
Most certainly. Marlene, how would this affect global and as well as the local food prices?
So I think there's multiple facets that you should keep in mind when thinking about food prices. So if we start off with some of the energy issues that Roland referred to, I think we've seen since the start of the insurgent that oil prices really rallied, touching on $130 to the barrel. And that's already a significant contributor to food inflation, if you think that that's a key component in food manufacturing, food distribution, and the likes. But there's also a link to staple food markets in the sense that grains and oilseeds are used for biofuels. And so when oil prices rally, we typically also see commodity prices following suit. So there's definitely a pull action there on global commodity prices. And the view for oil prices is that it will remain firm. So there's two sources that I am quite keen to consult. The first is the International Energy Agency, and the second, I have to look at my notes because otherwise I get confused with abbreviations because they have the same letters.
Join the club. I've been big in mine.
But it's the Energy Information Administration, and I think the latter view on oil prices is that it, at least until the middle of the year, will stay close to $160 to the barrel, and then ease off to around 105 towards the second half of the year. So there is possibly some relief, but I think the essence is that this is still much higher than what we saw at the beginning of 2022. So there will definitely be pressure on global food prices in that sense. Then I think it's also what we should keep in mind when thinking about global prices is also, yes, the Ukraine played a huge role in this upward price surge that we've seen up until now. But the story now gets much broader than that. Russia is a key supplier of fertilizers, and Brazil, which is busy with their second maize crop now, is quite reliant on Russia for their fertilizer imports. So news reports suggest that fertilizer imports into Brazil is much lower than previous years, and that could affect the yield of key crops such as corn and soybeans in Brazil, which would ultimately then also serve as price support for global food prices. And then also what's going to happen in the northern hemisphere in terms of how much they plant, how would they respond to the high prices that we're currently seeing, and how would these extreme high energy and obviously derived from that high fertilizer costs impact their ability to have a strong supply response to the high prices that we are currently seeing. Also, what could be a wild card is if you think of the weather in the US. Typically in La Nina seasons, we could get dryness to the west in the US, which could also impact their yield and then could fuel grain and oilseed prices further. So that's also something to consider. And I think just taking a step back and touching on the fertilizer issues again, there's two elements to that. The first is the energy prices that we've touched on, so that's high, and as a feedstock into fertilizer production, the manufacturing of fertilizer would, in all likelihood, the cost would remain high, and as a result, fertilizer prices would remain high. But also logistical disruptions makes access to fertilizer very difficult. So I think there's these two issues to consider when you think about inputs, and also when you need to plan for inputs for the seasons ahead.
And then, Marianne, when you think about those sort of challenges that are facing the agricultural sector, from a governmental perspective, are there any support measures that could be put in place to support players there?
So I know that there's been talks about scrapping the fuel levy, so that would go a long way in supporting, giving broad-based support. I mean, not just for producers but consumers as well. But there's not any subsidies in South Africa that helps producers. In other African countries, inputs such as fertilizer do get subsidized. But then I think a question to consider there is the fiscal impact of these absolutely high fertilizer prices. So how would a government or budget for something like that in order to support their producers? I think that's a concern for food security in the broader region.
Roland, Marianne giving us the macroeconomic context in that regard. Now, from a political landscape context, how could this affect politics?
Definitely. One must look at the context, the reality. South Africa, for instance, you have many poor people. You have people who have just come out of 2 years of stringent regulations that impacted their survival due to COVID. There's been emergency measures to support people, a 350 Rand a month grant, which is not much, but it at least kept people going. So if you look at that and you now look at higher inflation, food inflation, extremely expensive fuel, which is going to impact traveling, people trying to go to work, it's going to have a huge impact. And then one must look at this in a bigger context. We've just had the July last year incidents, the report on that has been released, flagging the dangers of another outbreak of violence.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of issue that can trigger that, especially if aligned to a very volatile political environment. divisions in the governing party, going into a leadership election.
Yes.
Those are risky issues that can play into this, and or this can be used to play into the party political dimension. So yes, there are increased risks, there are elevated tensions, and this is the time for a government to be very wide awake, to be very careful, and take decisions in the context of this reality. I know there's talk of South Africa benefiting from better prices for commodities that are exported, but that does not impact the normal people. It doesn't impact poor people. It impacts companies and it impacts government income. The question is, what can government do to alleviate this tension and this issue? Because we know our government is very, very thinly spread at this stage due to the economic realities and the support it has already given.
Yeah.
So this happening on the back of COVID is actually altogether bad news.
Roland, just a question coming through from a Business Day. The question is, could Roland elaborate on the comment he made about how the Russia-Ukraine conflict may affect the climate funding pledge that EU countries made to SA?
I think it's difficult to be specific at this stage, but there is already indications that one of the longer term consequences may be that European governments start looking at funding a much quicker transition for themselves in terms of moving away from natural gas, etc., and moving to alternate sources of energy. And that may actually create a new divide in the world between those who have money to go quicker into a transition and green energy, and those who are going to be left behind because they are going to wait for money to assist them. They don't have it in terms of their own sources. And that may impact environments such as South Africa, where there's an expectation of external involvement. Sharing of the burden, in a sense. There was a strong argument that for the Northern Hemisphere to play a positive role in terms of managing climate change, for instance, it must assist the South to get quicker movement, more effective movement into changing the use of energy and the long-term energy sources. In that way, you contribute to limiting the damaging gases and stuff that affect climate change. And the fear now is that it may actually not happen as planned and as expected, because Europe is now under pressure. If you look at the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the UK, for instance, the cost of housing, warming houses, food, etc., it's massive. I mean, the Johnson government has already started subsidizing people in terms of energy costs. From now to July, there's a subsidy in the UK because people can't afford to pay energy costs anymore. So those are real, those are direct impacts. And these are also governments that have to go to elections. They are not authoritarian governments that can repress the pushback that they're going to get. Same in Germany, same in Italy, same in France. So these governments have to look at the domestic environment first. And if there's a need to address that market, they are not going to look at the rest of the world and say, we have to solve the other problems. They are going to solve their own problems first. And that is the kind of scenario that may impact others such as South Africa negatively.
And just on that point, Roland, obviously we know that South Africa, along with other countries, are part of the BRICS formation. We've seen a couple of news articles wherein obviously South Africa, what responsibility rather South Africa should have in as far as having a view, which is I'm sure a very difficult ask for any government in this regard. Does being part of that particular formation, where one of your allies is involved in a conflict of this magnitude, put a certain amount of pressure on the South African government?
Definitely so. And I think the South African government is in a difficult position in that it is forced to choose between direct interests and direct political relationships and the values, the norms, and the laws of international relations. If your decision is based on the norms and the law that exist, you have to go with the majority, 141 countries in the UN, that voted for a resolution that says Russia is acting illegally, must immediately withdraw from Ukraine. South Africa abstained. If your foreign policy is directed and your position is driven by your links to other governments, BRICS, China, India, both abstained from the vote. India and Russia has close military ties going back decades. That's changing now, but it's changing slowly. India said, we stay out of this one. China obviously is staying out of it for different reasons, but there are more and more indications that China is reconsidering and is starting to act in a way that's not going to make life easier for Russia. So BRICS, in a sense, is sending mixed signals. Brazil has voted for the resolution, so it broke ranks with the rest of BRICS. And I think that's the key issue. There are different interpretations of how closely BRICS countries are aligned. Some say they are very close, they follow each other, and there are those who say no, it's actually a relationship that is based on interests, but if your interests are not served, you do your own thing. It's not formalized in the way that other relationships are, that other organizational structures have come about in international relations. So the issue here is, what is the interest of South Africa? If China decides to play a role in helping to stop the conflict and getting to a negotiated outcome, a diplomatic solution, and South Africa aligns with that, that's positive. But if China is sitting this thing out and seeing what's going to happen, because it thinks it will benefit from whatever the fallout and the damage that Russia is going to cause will be, South Africa finds itself in a very difficult situation. And there may be negative long-term consequences. The European Union may look at South Africa differently in the future, saying, you're not a dependable ally. You did not support this crucial issue on the merits, the values, and international law. You took an ideological decision. It's, again, one would have to see how it plays out.
Most certainly. Just a reminder to you, our viewers, that you too are part of this conversation. If you do have any questions for us that we can ask both Roland and Marlene, please do not hesitate to use the functionality on your screen to do that. Coming back to you, Marlene, I loved how Roland was talking about long-term consequences, obviously coming off. In fact, we are still within a COVID-19 environment. We saw how the agricultural sector was one of the hardest hit. GDP numbers coming out a couple of weeks or days back, and we see that the agricultural sector is starting to pick up steam, starting to recover or try and make amends in that regard. How does this particular situation hinder that recovery process?
Thanks, Suki. I think over the past 2 years, agriculture was actually one of the few subsectors that performed quite well. So I think 13.1% growth in 2020 and a little more modest in 2021. And I think that the conflict in the Ukraine poses a big threat to the contribution that the agricultural industry can make. So for various reasons, I think 2022 will probably be another year in which the performance will be quite well based on performance of the grain sector, underpinned by these high prices that we are currently seeing. But as we move on to longer term prospects, I mean, we are very concerned about the high input costs and the effects that would have on producers and the industry's ability to perform. And also what we've highlighted in terms of global trade, in terms of it getting harder to be involved in global markets would obviously also weigh on the sector's performance, because we are geared towards servicing export markets, especially in the horticultural space, so in terms of fruit. So I do think that this poses a risk to the performance that we could see over the coming years from the sector.
And then from a lender perspective, obviously as Absa, we also have a vested interest in ensuring that the agricultural sector does continue to show signs of resilience. What are we doing, or what can we do as the private sector, particularly as lenders in this space?
So I think there's multiple roles that we could fulfill, but I think the most pertinent one is to share information and to do things like we are doing today with Roland, to kind of highlight some of the issues and how this could potentially play out. I think in these times it's key that the different stakeholders in the value chain, and this is not just for agricultural and food manufacturing, but manufacturing in general, speak to one another and convey the issues and the disruptions in the chains and make sure that chains are resilient enough to respond to that. And in that sense, I think one should always also be encouraged, especially if you're a primary agricultural producer, to speak to your bank, to make sure that you have enough and timely finance in place to weather the storm for things like very high input costs or input costs that could potentially, where the procurement follows another rhythm as opposed to what it did in the past. Make sure that you are prepared, and also, I mean, share the struggles or the challenges that you face as a result of the current circumstances. I think we are all learning, we're all in uncertain times, and we're keen to leverage on what the others know and have experienced to kind of work towards a better outcome.
And staying with you, Marlene, we do have a question from Hugo Pinar from the Bureau of Economic Research. And Hugo writes, could Marlene give us an indication of the typical lag between higher SAFEX wheat prices and the price of bread in South Africa? We already saw a sharp monthly increase in grains component in the CPI during February. This predates the Russian invasion. So how much more of this could be in the offering in the near term?
Thanks, Suki. That's a good question. So I think what we've seen over the past is it typically takes between 3 to 4 months for changes in commodity markets to manifest in food prices, be it maize meal or bread prices. But I also think what should be kept in mind is that this is actually just new momentum to a wave of price increases that we've seen since the beginning of 2021. And those price increases were underpinned by an uptick in demand as the world emerged from the pandemic, rebuilding of the Chinese pork or swine herd that drew a lot of maize to that market. Climate goals that allocated more commodities towards biofuel production. So I think this, or the dynamics in the Ukraine and how that can possibly play out, is just adding an additional element that causes the prices to surge further beyond what we've seen since 2021. And a lot of what Hugo is referring to is possibly an extension of what we've been seeing over the past 18 months.
We do have another question from Dineen Erasmus from Business Day. This one is also for you too, Marlene. What interventions from government, you mentioned earlier, suspending the fuel levy is one option, would have the broadest impact for farmers and consumers in South Africa in keeping food inflation at reasonable levels over the next 12 months?
That is a good question, and I think that's something that policymakers and numerous other institutions, NGOs, grapple with. How do we keep everyone food secure and food affordable? And I don't think there's an easy answer, because South Africa is essentially a price taker for essential staples like maize and wheat from global prices. So I think definitely the fuel exemption of the fuel levy has merit, and it would have a broad-based impact. but I don't have a shortcut or a silver bullet in terms of what can be done to mitigate the effects of this rising food prices.
If I may, just practical terms. I spoke to a friend over the weekend. He takes 600 liters of diesel in one of his tractors. He needs to go and plow and prepare to plant. 600 liters at a go at the current prices. Compare that to prices a year ago. And this just to bring it down to the reality for people. It's easy to talk about this in macro terms, but the impact is very real. If you're talking about, we used to putting 40, 60 liters, maybe 80 liters into a petrol tank, fuel tank, 600 liters at a go, some 400 liters, but just turn that into a monetary value and then start calculating. That thing is not as economical to run as your normal car. It's quite a heavy use, so it's a massive impact at the bottom line. And if nothing is done to that, that cost cannot be absorbed by the producer. It's too much. So it must go somewhere. And that's the increased pressure on people economically, but also politically. We must also keep in mind we have a huge problem with unemployment. And the news that we're sharing today just indicates one thing again, that we're not going to see a sudden uptick in employment levels. We're probably going to see a very subdued next few months at least. So the short to medium term is going to be difficult for many people, and that's going to increase pressure on government a lot. And hence the importance of the question, what can they do? What options do they have? If I may add something else to all the bad news. Remember, we're also coming out of this era of state capture and massive corruption in South Africa. That has depleted the coffers of government to a large extent. I mean, if we go back to the budget this year, it was funded by what is called windfall income. Sudden higher income from the mining sector mostly. But that's a once-off. You can't depend on that into the long term for planning purposes. So what is happening around us is going to increase the pressure on people. It's going to increase the pressure on government. I think what we can safely say is we're in for some tough times.
And Roland, just on that, from a public policy perspective, are we sound?
Yes and no. Yes, in that there are good initiatives, good policies. Problem we have is the execution part of policy. I mean, yesterday was World Water Day, and we talked about it, and we have very good water management policies. But what's happening at ground level? We see a floundering system of municipal government. We see very poor management of water resources. That's going to have a massive impact in the long run on quality of life. Water security impacts food security. So these things are interlinked. So yes, we have very good policy frameworks, but we are not executing, we're not executing efficiently, and we have serious challenges with the people who are responsible to manage these processes. And that's where we have to pay much more attention. That's medium to longer term, but those are serious and real challenges for us.
Yep. I think maybe just also to add to that, there's been some major disruptions to ongoing initiatives. I mean, COVID and this war now. So the longer goals, things like we earlier spoke about, climate change, I think to some extent that has now taken somewhat of a backseat. And I think the broader issues around climate change also complicates the energy crisis that we are seeing, because now there's also a moral dimension to how do we expand crude oil production away from Russian sources, because we've actually committed as a planet to move away from fossil fuels. So I think if we look into history, there's a saying that high prices takes care of high prices. So in the case of oil, if you think of 2008, there was these really high prices comparable to what we are seeing now. But the fracking industry, especially in the US, caused prices to come down substantially towards the middle of the 2010s. The bigger question is, would we see that now, given commitments made in terms of our climate goals and reducing carbon emissions?
Thanks, Marianne. I'm just taking a question from the floor. This one is from Hamlet from Indini, and this one I'll pose to both of you. Maybe Roland, you can tackle it first. The question from Hamlet is: wheat is a very important grain commodity in the South African market. As the country, we import about 40% of wheat annually, with a third of that coming from Russia and Ukraine in the past. Does the war between these two countries not present an opportunity for South Africa to expand its wheat production to try and offset the portion that is imported from these countries, or from any other country for that matter?
Yes, there's always the potential, but then one must look at the reality. How much more can we produce? Do we have enough space? Do we have enough people with the equipment, the knowledge, the skills, and the finances to get into this and start producing? Can we produce? What's the cost differential between what we produce and what we pay for what we import from countries such as Ukraine? So those are important issues. But what I think is important here also from a geopolitical perspective is that countries such as South Africa must start looking more closely at the region again, the Southern African region, and the potential from that region, both for production and as a market. That's the trend that we're probably going to see in the rest of the world playing out. Not this one open market, but more focus on regional markets closer to home. And then South Africa is an important role player. We have much more influence in Southern Africa than I think we always acknowledge. So we can play a much different role and have more control over our immediate environment than we would have in a faraway place such as Ukraine. Also, it would have probably less of a direct impact on us if we were focused closer to home and the opportunities that it presents. So yes, but this is not a short-term solution. This is not an automatic, you don't flip a switch and then you produce more wheat. It just doesn't work like that. So one must be very careful how you frame that as an option and how you actually go for it as an option.
And Marianne?
Yes, so I think it should be evaluated. I mean, there was a stage when we did produce substantially more wheat, but I think given the risk associated with it and the more lucrative returns associated with other crops resulted in the area diminishing. So I mean, given the current high prices, there is possibly scope to expand area a little, but I don't foresee wheat taking shares from other key crops such as canola and barley, and also you need to keep in mind in the Western Cape, in terms of rotational cropping, you can't expand at your discretion. It's part of a system, in a production system with which you plant. So I think there is room to expand our wheat production, but not to the extent that will replace imports in its totality.
And then Marianne, I know you did indicate earlier on that Absa does not necessarily have an official view on oil prices. I wonder what the view is, or what the view was before we saw this conflict just on the agricultural sector as a whole. What the view was, or from the sources that you do consult or read, what the view was before and what the view is now with the conflict having started in Ukraine.
Thanks, Zuki. I think that's a valid question. So I think at the start of the year, when we considered and planned and looked at projections, the market sentiment pointed to an average for 2022 of around $85 to the barrel. Obviously, there was a huge distribution around that. And now, given the invasion, it's around $115 to the barrel. But I think inventories were already under pressure. OPEC had a very modest expansion approach to the increased demand that we saw after as the world kind of emerged from COVID, and now also I think there are Middle Eastern countries such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia that could potentially have spare capacity to fill some of the gap that's left by Russia, but there doesn't seem to be any movement on their side to do that, and I don't know if Roland maybe has insights on that.
I think there are two issues. It's always easy to focus on high oil prices, but we must remember we come from extremely low oil prices during COVID, so the oil producers have also taken a knock, and I think they are just using the opportunity now to replenish a bit. There will be increased production from some of the key role players in the Middle East, but politically they're playing it very carefully. Remember, Russia is a key member of OPEC. They need Russia on side, or they needed Russia on side to take decisions up to now. That may change. Russian oil and gas may become a no-go area for quite some time, and so you'll have to replace that. So what countries such as the UAE and the others must do is keep Russia, not offend Russia and make it an enemy, but also not act in such a way that Europe and North America starts branding them as being countries who have no sense of responsibility and who are manipulating and abusing the situation for short-term gains. So they're going to play a very careful role, but they're not going to just allow prices to come down with massive production. Also, they don't have the production capacity to make up the Russian shortfall. But we're seeing interesting developments that may lead to other changes. Talks being held with countries that have been kind of off limits. Venezuela. There was an important meeting with American leaders and Venezuela in the last week. And one of the issues was, can we get more oil production from there if we change some of the sanctions against Venezuela? What about Nigeria and Angola? Can there be changes in terms of what they produce and not only sell to Russia or China or wherever, but also, so there are alternatives, and we may see some changes coming in at the global level that is driven more by politics than by only energy needs. Economics will always be important, but politics can play into this, and we may see more of that happening in the short term.
Sticking with you, Roland, I'm going to take you back to those scenarios that we touched on earlier. We do have a question from the chat or the chat line, and this is from Deirdre from Senec. Deirdre asks, could Roland please sketch 2 scenarios where Russia and Ukraine do come to an agreement within a week, or so, if this carries on for 6+ months? 2 scenarios.
Okay, if there's a quick agreement, it means the Russian military campaign has basically failed. It's bombed out. Putin has no other options. He has to come to an agreement. That would mean an agreement that says probably Ukraine sovereignty, possibly not getting back all the territory that the Russians has occupied, especially since 2014. And then probably the quid pro quo would be you never become a member of NATO. We guarantee to some extent your sovereignty, your nationhood as is, but you are not going to align yourselves, especially not militarily. And you will not allow weapon systems that are going to be threatening to Russia. So but that's a very positive outcome. It's an unlikely one at this stage, but that's if things happen very quickly. That may be driven by humanitarian issues more than political issues also. But the requirement for that is the military campaign flounders completely. If it continues and we don't have a decisive victory, and that would mean a decisive victory by Russia. Ukraine cannot have a decisive victory on its own. It just doesn't have the capability. It can survive. It can engage in a war of attrition. It can survive the Russian onslaught. If that goes on for quite some time, depending on the pressures that build on Mr. Putin and how effective that is going to be managed from the outside world and domestically. We don't really know the domestic context, but there are important indications. That combination may weaken Mr. Putin, may limit his freedom of choice and options, and that may actually empower Ukraine with the backing of the European Union, of NATO, even if only indirectly, to probably demand more and get more of its status as a sovereign nation, get more control of its territory, at least some of its access to the ports, which is quite important to it, so that may play out. The issue is, the longer this continues, who's going to foot the bill for the rebuilding of Ukraine? Because the country is being destroyed bit by bit.
Yep.
And there's an historical lesson in this. I mean, we saw what happened in the Chechenian war in Grozny. Russian forces were not scared to demolish that city, literally bomb it off the map. We saw it happening in Aleppo in Syria, same thing, where there is no holds barred when they come under pressure. So the longer this conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes for Russia, but the more damage they cause. And that is going to require a massive plan and a plan of action to rebuild Ukraine. The question is, who's going to foot that bill? Ukraine cannot. I mean, there's not much left of the country in that scenario. Will it be Europe? What's the extent to which they are willing to go? A kind of Marshall Plan, maybe, Europe and North America. And to what extent will Russia be held responsible and will have to pay damages in some form? And this may be important. Remember, there's already an International Court of Justice hearing that happened in the last week that came out and said what Russia has done is illegal, they must withdraw. So it's not just a political decision, there's also a legal support in terms of international law. And those are all issues that's going to determine the details of what happens and what the outcome will be.
Thank you so much, Roland. As we come to the close of our discussion, I do have one more question for you, and we've most certainly run out of time, so I'll make it quick. And this one is from Melissa van der Merwe, and she asks, what are our farmers' sentiments in terms of current and next production seasons? Are we expecting smaller volumes due to unexpected higher prices?
Thanks, Zuki, and thanks, Melissa. I think that at the moment, our summer grains are progressing nicely. It looks very good, and this was all planted, and the decisions to plant or not to plant was far from when the Russians invaded the Ukrainians. So in that sense, the sentiment I would expect amongst producers would be favorable, because prices does look very positive. I think for the upcoming winter grain season, it can also still be a continuation of that sentiment, in the sense that most farmers did procure their inputs before all of these disruptions and turmoil, and prices are looking good, so we expect a favorable response in terms of the area that would be planted. Our concern, and I've mentioned this, is towards the 2022-2023 season. Although I think most of the emotion from that early price run and panic buying in terms of fertilizer and inputs have died down somewhat, we are still concerned about supply chain disruptions that could lead to problems with the availability of fertilizer and other inputs.
Thank you so much, Marley. And just the closing remarks, very quick, guys. We've definitely passed through our hour. Your closing remarks, Roland.
I think we're in for difficult times, challenging times, but also interesting times. Probably looking at a different world than what we've become accustomed to in the last 15 years especially. Deeper divisions. Probably going to put more pressure on governments such as that of South Africa to in some way choose.
Yeah.
You're going to be hard pressed to stay out of everything, to not be neutral, not just be non-aligned, but the combination of these things is going to be difficult. And then for normal people, we're going to feel the outcomes of this for quite some time in terms of cost of living and the pressures that creates.
And for you, Marlene?
Yeah, so I think I echo Roland's sentiments. It is definitely uncharted waters, but there is also opportunities, and I think renewables is one that jumps to mind. I think the oil prices is definitely something that everyone in the economy grapples with, but then there's again opportunities to kind of leapfrog into a new scenario where we're more reliant on renewables. So I don't think it's all just doom and gloom. I think it's definitely uncertain times, but the key thing is to navigate these uncertainties by engaging with the different people in your business sphere and your suppliers and your customers to make sure that we can be as prepared as we possibly could, given all the uncertainties that surround us.
Marlene, thank you so much. Roland, thank you so much to
Thank
you
you.
too.
Thanks,
And with that, we have unfortunately come to the end of our time with you. And thank you so much for all your questions. And of course, for also having tuned in as you heard those sentiments of both from Roland and Marlene, that what we are witnessing, of course, is unprecedented. And as we navigate the current terrain, certainly a lot of uncertainty at bay. And let me say a big thank you once again to Roland Henwood, who is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, as well as, of course, Marlene Lowe, who is a senior economist here at Absa Agribusiness. And from me, Zugelwa Solomon, and the technical team behind this production, thank you so much and goodbye.